Like we don't teach success, right? We don't teach how to manipulate debt. We don't teach how to deal with taxes at a young age. And the things that actually dictate how far you can push the ball, that's not something we generally teach unless you're already in a position where you have access to.
You're on your
going
way.
to private schools. You're going to.
I can kind of criticize like the people that pay lip service to it and the people that are in a position to do something about it. Like for me, I don't see why Google or Microsoft or Facebook can't hire 10,000 apprentice programmers from the inner city and train them to be something bigger than they are now. And again, some of these bigger tech companies can solve some of these economic problems. I'm not sure government can. But every time government tries to solve one of these problems, they're solving it in this like backward way that won't really work and creates all these other weird incentives. It's really a matter of jobs and training and things like that. And I hesitate to say that like maybe the job givers should be involved in our upbringings earlier and earlier, and that we've had this perpetuation of this myth that like school is the answer to everything, and that the university especially is the cure for all that ails you. And I think we've learned painfully that that's not the case, and that spending a ton of money at a sort of C-level college is not a good idea, and that liberal arts educations were built for the Victorian era, and that people should be programmers and data analysts and even IT maintenance people, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that we should probably start that process younger than we do, and maybe get a chance to get people to say, well, I'd rather not join this gang because in 4 years I'm going to be making this much money, and that's a better deal than being part of the Bloods. Whereas if the answer is, well, you're going to go to college, but you're going to be in debt, and when you're 22, you might start making half the money the drug dealer's making. That doesn't work for anybody with some common sense.
Right, and that's the interesting thing, right? Like, I didn't grow up in a good area either. I mean, to my mind, the kinds of people who sell drugs at a high level, all of these things, is no different really than a CEO in terms of what they're doing, right? This is supply and demand. This is marketing. This is all of these things. The only real difference is it's illegal. And if it makes more sense for a kid who grew up, like you said, in the Bronx, in Queensbridge, wherever, and when we start moralizing, we start getting into like why they do what they do, it gets really weird because there's so much rhetoric.
Well,
you brought
also,
up being a libertarian earlier. Do you see that dichotomy as big government and small government? Because to me, it seems like there's a good regulation and bad regulation. It always felt strange to me.
Yeah, I tend to just think virtually all of government's actions, no matter how well-intentioned, come out poorly. One counterexample that I like is the FDA. The FDA tends to, from my purview, because I know it well, they tend to get things right. And I think most people would say, well, if you knew what we did at the DOJ, you know that we tend to get things right too. And that may be true. I don't know. But I know the FDA up close and personal, and I know the FDA is actually pretty good at what it does. So I tend to see the problems that we all see and think that a smaller government's the solution. But I don't know for sure that a smaller government would be better. Maybe it would be worse, right? I don't know. And there's only one way to sort of find out, which is impossible, which is to do a large-scale experiment. And there's not two United Stateses, right? So there's sort of confounding variables that could actually help you get the answer to this experiment. And you certainly might say, well, do you remember when so-and-so was in power, it was so much better? But the country is constantly changing, growing, shrinking, all kinds of things are happening. So I don't know that there's an easy way to say, well, Nixon did it right, or Reagan did it right, or whatever the case is, Clinton did it right.
There's social and economic forces that play here. They're not. They're not. There's a degree to which they're not intentional. It's emergent. There's multivariate, and it's to like the nth degree.
Yeah, I think you're saying that. Yeah, you're saying that all really correctly, right? It's hard to assign causality. It's we certainly see that a lot with presidents, right? The economy gets bad in a president's time. It's probably the former president's. It's almost certainly the former president's policies. But it's his problem now. Right? That's sort of the funniest thing, is that people, don't understand that kind of lagging effect that tends to take many, many years of policy implementation to become reality. You get people getting kicked out of office for something that had nothing to do with them. And so, it's such a very difficult thing to sort of figure out. But regardless, I mean, I think that certainly, looking at sort of some of the governments, especially I'd say the FBI, which, ordinarily I'd say does a really good job, but has gotten so big. Government, one of the biggest problems with government is they never restructure, right? You never hear about, okay, FBI decides it's going to lay off 10% of all employees. That's something corporate America does that's really healthy. Every now and then you just kind of have to kick out the old people and kind of trim the fat a bit and You do that in a corporate restructuring. But governments never restructure. Their agencies and their bureaucracies just get bigger and bigger and bigger. You never hear about, oh, today we've decided to close down Homeland Security and merge it together with the FBI to form one intelligence agency instead of having all three. I just don't think we need 100 law enforcement agencies. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, seems to me like there's probably a lot of overlap. And the problem with FBI specifically, and again, I appreciate the people at the FBI that do an honest day's work, that stop terrorism, that stop serious crime every day. And those people, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them. I'm not saying that we don't. But what I don't like is if you have 50,000 FBI agents and there's 40,000 FBI agents worth of crime, what does the other 10,000 do? And we're not a country that tends to want to say, well, they should find new jobs. That's what a corporation would say. We would tend to say, let's find more crime. I think you end up having this really bizarre incentive to find crime where crime doesn't exist. And there's always crime, obviously. But you end up having a relative kind of fight over what is the crime we should be punishing. And I'll give you an example of Varsity Blues, Operation Varsity Blues, where a bunch of people cheated on the SATs and cheated on their ability to get into their kids into better colleges than they deserved. This is not the kind of thing that the US government should be intervening on. This is a silly, dumb excursion of important resources, the same resources that are fighting terrorism, the same resources that are fighting crucial, crime, are fighting whether or not some kid cheated to get into some crappy school. It's not going to help to get into UCLA versus, San Diego State, or even to get into Harvard versus Dartmouth. Harvard kids know who belong there. Trust me, there's plenty of people. You could tell right away which Harvard kid, got in there because of nepotism or paid to get in there, and which ones earned it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that it's not the top priority, right? In terms of like the grand picture, it is their purview, though, the FBI.
Yes,
right?
And their purview should be serious crime that merits serious federal taxpayer money, right? I don't want my taxpayer money to go to fight that. Or I'll give you another example: the Harvard professor who failed to disclose that he had a Chinese grant. This is the most innocuous thing. People fail to grow. If you're from academics, people fail to disclose these grants all the time. People have hundreds of these side gigs. To get this guy federally indicted, okay, maybe Harvard should fire the guy, but that's the worst that should happen. To put this 70-year-old professor in prison, this doesn't make any sense. Then you had another series of these which were just completely nuts. There was a corporate debate, and in fact, my prosecution was a corporate fight. It was me versus my old company. They went and they called some lawyers that used to work in the government, and they got me indicted. That's literally the words they used. The same thing happened with this guy at Google who went to go over to Uber. Technically, stealing trade secrets is a crime, and Google got this guy arrested. And Trump pardoned him, thank God. But it's that easy. You can dial a prosecutor and get somebody indicted if you have the right connections. So to me, that's all a sign of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office being too big. Ultimately, they should be deciding between, okay, I got a potential murder suspect that's killed 5 people. Now say this is federal, so you can substitute it with whatever crime you want. That's maybe not a murder. And then I've got another crime where a guy's a serial killer of 10 people. Which one should I take? That's the kind of crime they should be deciding against. Not, did this kid cheat on the SATs? Are you kidding me? That's, these agencies are I think, too big, too bloated. How many of these are there? The alphabet soup is nuts. DNI, HHS, CIA, FBI, ATF, DEA. How many crime agencies do we need? And I've only named a couple. I mean, there's more than that.
I wanted to ask how prison was during COVID.
Oh, it was terrible.
Your experience.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, really terrible. Prison's bad enough as it is. It's there's something about, I did solitary confinement 3 times, twice for suspicion of having a cell phone, even though there was no cell phone. I had one, but they didn't have it. So they had the right suspicion, but they didn't have the. That's not a charge technically. They can still do it, and they did it in my case. So I spent time in this windowless room for a month, where it's called solitary confinement. It's also called the hole or whatever. And what I found, which was really interesting, is that isolation is a punishment. Which you would think, what's the worst thing about solitary confinement? You actually get the same food. You get, the room is not that much bigger or smaller or anything. That's sort of the same. You have to wear your boxers, which is pretty funny. but not that punitive. You don't get a blanket, which again is kind of like, oh, what a big punishment, you know? You don't get a pillow. You sort of get these things when you're not in solitary confinement, but it's not that different in terms of like you know, the biggest thing is you don't get to chat with your buddies. And in prison, you make buddies. And you chat about whatever. You chat about the good old days. You chat about the girl you have waiting for you back home. You chat about whatever you want. And when you take that away, that's actually the punishment, is not being around your friends. And to me, it's such a startling thing to realize that when I'm sitting here and going through solitary confinement and I'm sort of thinking that this is like psychological torture, the torture is just not being able to have a conversation and connect to another human. You also have to share a bathroom with another dude, which means you have to hear him take a crap and do all that, which is not good. But so anyway, the point I'm making is that solitary confinement sucks. Prison under COVID was a lot like solitary confinement. We had no visitors. We had a number of other kind of restrictions that made the normal prison experience pretty similar to solitary confinement. And again, the point is for a lot of people, oh, well, boo-hoo, you're a felon. That's just the way it is. That's part of the punishment. You sign up for the crime, you got to do the time. Well, that's all true. But there's one thing that we didn't sign up for, which is torture. And I think nobody thinks that a prisoner should be tortured. Maybe some people do. Depends on the crime, I guess. Some people get put to death for their crimes. And maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. I don't know. But I think that very few people think that a drug dealer should be tortured physically. And mental torture can be as bad as physical torture. And I think that I did find it somewhat, torture is a strong word, but I found it psychologically difficult to do solitary confinement. I found myself to be really relieved when solitary confinement was over. And there are many people, including the UN, I believe, that have a specific sort of doctrine against torture, Amnesty International and others, that state that the torture includes psychological torture, and solitary confinement is indeed psychological torture and should be used only in the most extreme situations. Not just, I went to prison, I went to solitary confinement once for putting the wrong name on an envelope. I'm dead serious. So solitary is bad, but COVID was basically solitary for everyone. No visitors, you couldn't get out of your quarters, which basically is sort of like a cell. It was sort of like on a scale of 1 to solitary, it was sort of like a 7 or an 8. So it wasn't completely like solitary confinement, which was pretty bad. So that was sort of the problem. I would say the sickness and all that stuff. Well, we're in such close quarters that it's impossible to social distance, and wearing a mask doesn't do anything, but we still had to wear masks and still had to try social distancing. So it was pretty frustrating to see all that, even though you would have to wear a mask, even though you slept 3 feet away from another guy. You still had to wear a mask, which was really kind of funny. You didn't have to wear a mask in your cell, but again, we were all sort of on the same computers, on the same everything. So it really didn't make much sense. We're in the same bathrooms. I mean, you had a bathroom that was quite small with 6 people in it. Wearing a mask and stuff like that not going to help. So we all got COVID inevitably, and got sick. And again, the freedoms that we had, like the gym, were gone. Even the yard, where the yard is a pretty simple pleasure, just being able to walk around and get some fresh air. We had no yard time whatsoever. So again, sort of psychological torture. You take somebody, you put them in a place away from their family, and you say you're not allowed to get sunshine or exercise or anything like that. You got to sit in this room for the next several years. In my case, less years than some people who had to sit there for 10 or 15 years. One of the simplest human things we have that's so valuable is just the ability to talk to other humans and just to find common ground. So people who didn't graduate high school, who have killed people, who've dealt drugs across state to state for cartels. These were my friends in prison. Like, I had nobody else to talk to. And even people like that and me could find common ground, and of course we disagree about things too. But like, just the ability to knock on your neighbor's door and BS about something is one of the basic human rights and pleasures that we have. And again, you might think that some people don't. Some people might think that some people are so bad that they don't even deserve that. But I think that most people would agree that is a human right. So, but yeah, no, we still have a Discord. It's discord.gg/Martin Shkreli, or discord.com/Martin Shkreli.
I'm more interested in terms of your overall perspective, having seen 2 different worlds. You saw the wealthiest, the most powerful class in America, right? And you've also seen like the regular schmegular Joe. I'm curious, do you think like the ruling class or the elites are selling out the nation to foreign entities, whether it be China, whether it be multinational corporations. What's your opinion on that?
I'd say no, at least intentionally, maybe unintentionally, possibly. I don't know about that. But in terms of like some cabal sitting around and saying, let's do this or that, I don't think you see that. But I do think like, it's funny. I had a recent conversation with a very prominent, everybody would know the name, venture capitalist, and he said, I care that in your company that there aren't any Chinese investors. I want there to be only American investors. And I thought that was really weird because I never heard that once in my career. And I think this person has been seeing more and more Chinese investors investing in American startups and trying to sort of be aware in them, or aware of them and sort of tracking them and being a part of them, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, I don't think that's wrong at all. If I were a Chinese investor, I'd be trying to track Chinese companies and American companies, and there are plenty of American investors who track Chinese companies really carefully. So to me, there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm not a globalist or whatever, but like I'm not a nationalist, and I don't believe that we're at this like really weird state, and where we're at sort of this Cold War with China that could become a hot war, and that we should really guard our national interests. And maybe I'm naive and stupid, and that I'll be eating my words soon. But I really don't get that sense, and I certainly don't know of any, weird secret cabal where people are meeting and talking about this kind of stuff.
There's this hot-button issue, right? Which is, what if the Chinese CCP invades Taiwan, right? I'm of the perspective, what do you think we should do, right? If you have any perspective, do you feel like our home economy, corporations are way too invested in this that it wouldn't be worth really seeking out conflict? Or is it more so, hey, it's the principle of like, we need to be number one?
Well, we don't have to be number one or number anything, right? I mean, I think that's the good news. I think the bad news, though, is this is sort of traditional business in the first place, right? If you have any single dominant supplier of an important good, and this is not the first time this has happened, obviously, you have to ask yourself these questions. And semiconductors are really important, but we still can make semiconductors without Taiwan Semi. They're the biggest producer, but the world won't stop because of Taiwan Semi stopping. And I think the bigger concern actually is APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are mostly made in India and China. Again, not in America. And you have to ask yourself, like, at what point does it become national security risk if all of our medicine is made overseas? That sounds like a serious risk, and it is.
Do you think that's deliberate on the Chinese perspective, and like that we're not necessarily paying attention to that?
It was mostly an Indian thing, to be honest. For a long time, China's recently gotten some market share, but it's really just kind of like these are relatively low-end goods that are easier to, at least the active pharmaceutical ingredient part of it. They're pretty low-end goods. They're basically just chemicals, and China's done pretty well in chemicals in general. Because they have great chemistry students, and so does India, obviously, and they're much cheaper than American chemists, and it ends up being worth it. And that happens a lot with electronics. It happens a lot with textiles. It happens a lot with kind of these low-end things that you don't need to worry about, and you just sort of trust this stuff, but they end up being really important. They're far more important than iPhones and things like that. And so I don't think it's some nefarious plot. I just think it's China's, booming economy, or was once booming at least, taking advantage of, and India's taking advantage of relative cost of labor and making a good profit. And it's made plenty of Indian billionaires, plenty of Chinese billionaires, and that's a good thing, right? That's the whole point of economies of scale, and that's the whole point of like relative advantages of production and things like that. Now, we do know also though that wars do happen, right? So when wars happen, you have this, and India is no exception from a country that could go to war, and that you have to be careful of those supply chain choke points, and that again applies to everything: food, energy, agriculture. We see the folly of Europe's energy problems right now, right? So I think ultimately, like, this is not a new thing, and we just have to sort of have some diversification. And I think that comes with kind of what that investor I was talking about earlier is talking about, which is like, okay, should we be willing, say as an American company, say you're Eli Lilly or Merck, should you be willing to buy a certain percentage of your APIs from an American supplier, even though you know it costs more than a Indian or Chinese supplier? And I think the answer is, there's never anything wrong with a little diversity in terms of supply chain or in terms
is it kind of a hedge? So let me ask you a question, because this is actually a really good point. I'm of the perspective that like whoever that investor was, right, whoever the VC was, that he, unless it's one of the ones who has historically said this, I think it's more so seasonal, right? And it's like, oh, the weather is cold, so I'm telling people to wear a jacket. But when the weather is warm, I'm not going to be packing a jacket. I'm just going to be like, going shirtless, which is what I think the market will kind of readjust in 5 years. My question is, what would you have done? Like personally, would you have actually shifted your manufacturing somewhat to America?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just in this, I think you're actually right in terms of the weather blowing. In this case, it is one of Trump's closest advisors and backers. But in terms of me personally, I think like most people, the profit motive is too great. If I noticed, let's say I was an API maker, which I'm not, I've never made APIs, I've only bought them. If I was an API maker and I got the sense that Merck and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and those companies wanted American-made API, then sure, I'd be proud to make a new API plant in New Jersey or New York or somewhere and say, okay, this API plant is open, and if you want to support America, then buy your API from America. And if that works, great, but I think that most of the buyers, they're price sensitive. And, if I got that sense though, absolutely, it'd be great. It's a lot easier to manage a plant in New Brunswick, New Jersey than in Hyderabad, India. I've started learning, a little bit of Hindi. It's so important out there, and I don't want to learn Hindi or Mandarin. I mean, it's much easier to deal with Americans, and, you have a little bit of nationalist pride. But for me, for business, I mean, it's profit is really important. And, customers, will shut you out and say, no, we'd rather have the pills or the chemicals that's $1,000 a kilo instead of $2,000 a kilo. That's an easy call for them to make. They don't care where it comes from.
I genuinely believe you when you say that. I think that's also the case for most industries and most business people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? To kind of obviously say we're individual firms, we're individuals, we need to seek our individual profits. Do you essentially think that's a major vulnerability for America, though, even though it's one of the most beautiful parts, which is a nation like China or a nation like Russia can say, hey, these individuals are going to take care of themselves. And basically, if we find a way to exploit this, we can have some leverage over their business and eventually their politics and eventually their people.
Yeah, I could see where you're coming from. I do think that's a little concerning. That's one of the, like, it reminds me of the old game Civilization, which I really enjoyed as a kid and even as an adult. Like, there is something to be said for if we get all our stuff from there, then, that is something we have over them. And typically that's not something that we have to worry about because they never have, other resources above us. But now you finally have China sort of looking like equal to the US possibly. And that's naturally kind of worrisome for some people, especially kind of the more hawkish type people. I sort of, again, I'm a little naive here where I'm thinking, well, at the end of the day, it's not such a bad thing that there are two superpowers. And, maybe, I don't see China as this belligerent, kind of like reckless country. But, you also could have said the same about Russia until recently. The other solutions aren't pretty. Like, for example, we can put an excise tax on everything, or we can force people to use domestic, manufacturing, and all that stuff leads to is economic troubles. It generally doesn't work. Protectionism generally doesn't work, but again, maybe in certain circumstances it could make sense for strategically important.
Would you feel comfortable? So, as a businessman, like, would you be okay with where China was like basically the most powerful country, America was like number 2, but like the rules of the game are basically the same? And maybe you have even more access to the markets. Like, would that be something that you would be against solely because like the national position has reduced, but potentially your individual position along with your colleagues could also be elevated?
I don't think it matters because at the end of the day, like, we have the most successful pharmaceutical industry in the world by far, but China's got other industries where it's number 1. And, you just have to sort of grin and bear it, right? I mean, each country has its own strategic advantages, and its companies sometimes, for example, we dominate sort of internet companies, but we don't dominate necessarily in other chip making, or I shouldn't say other chip making, other technologies. You know, where Japan certainly has an advantage in some of them, and China has an advantage in others, and and so forth. So ultimately, it each industry is unique, and I don't think our country should be in the business of saying we have to be number one in X, Y, or Z, unless it's a national security thing. And obviously, we have a pretty strong defense industry. So, maybe we should extend that a little bit to some other industries. I don't know. We certainly seem to be doing it with semiconductors. But I for one don't really understand it. I think graphics processors are pretty good for running video games, but I'm not sure what else they're really that valuable